providing amazing and very great technical support. So thank you very much to the two of you. Today's event, as you might have recognized, is slightly different than past Crypt events. And this is not only because it's obviously held online, but also because it's really an event that celebrates the recently published books by, I think, three immensely insightful and often very provocative, as we will hear today, international political theorists, and also importantly, three long-standing members of Crypt. So for Crypt, it's an honor and a pleasure that we have with us today, first, Professor William Callahan, who is Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics. And William combines in extremely interesting ways his research interests in the global politics of China and the theory of international relations. Today, William will introduce his latest book, published in 2020 with Oxford University Press, which is entitled Sensible Politics, Visualizing International Relations, and which promises to be the first book-length analysis of visuality multisensory politics. Second, we have Dr. Philip Cunliffe, who is a senior lecturer in international conflict at the University of Kent. Philip's research interests are in the areas of peacekeeping, humanitarian intervention, sovereignty, and critical IR theory. Let me just say on a personal note, probably, that for a scholar like myself, who seeks to, at least in extreme cases of mass atrocities, defend the practice of humanitarian intervention, Philip's critical thought on the responsibility to protect, on R2B, are, even when I disagree with them, always a formidable challenge. Today, however, he will talk about his latest work, which is entitled The New 20 Years Crisis, A Critique of International Relations, 1999 to 2019, which was published this year by McGill Queen's University Press. And finally, we have Dr. William Bain, who is Associate Professor at the National University of Singapore. Will's research interests are really at the intersection of IR theory, international political theory, and the history of political thought. So Will's work always had, I think, a very strong historical perspective. And in my view, but of course Will himself might disagree with me on this, in my view, his latest book is really the work in which he weaves together in very interesting ways the different strands that he produced in his previous books. So I'm looking forward to Will's presentation of his book, published also in 2020 with Oxford University Press, Political Theory of International Order. Each of the presenters will be given between 10 and 15 minutes to present. And after each individual presentation, there will be a 15-minute Q&A. We will get started with Bill Callahan, followed by Philip Cunliffe, and then Will Bain. Okay, Bill, over to you.
Okay, I want to thank Christof, Crypt, and BISA for this opportunity to talk about my new book, Sensible Politics, Visualizing International Relations. I'm going to try and use a, well, I was going to share a screen, but I guess I can't. I was going to share a couple of things. First, a PowerPoint presentation, but that's not entirely necessary. Maybe I should just see. This always happens. Whenever there's newish technology, it always takes a horribly long time to figure out how to use it. Oh, there we go. Okay. And it takes time. We going? Huh. Okay, well, I will just not share that screen, and hopefully the other screens will work better. So I guess one of the exciting trends in the study of IR right now, and in IR theory, is the growing appreciation of the visual in global politics. And in my book, I argue that social theory, political theory, and international relations need to shift from seeing politics in terms of textual analysis, in terms of even turning visuals and events into text to analyze them. It needs to shift from this to appreciate global politics as a multi-sensory performance. My book is a theoretical book, but it argues its points through analysis of controversies that are familiar to more general specialists in IR, such as violence and refugees in Syria and the global politics of surveillance on the internet. I analyze these examples to think about the relation between the verbal and the visual, between meaning and feeling, the iconic and the everyday, and between the West and the non-West. In the book, what I tried to do is kind of rethink how we analyze global politics, and I come up with two analytical strategies. The first is the social construction of the visual, and the second is the visual construction of the international, the visual construction of the social. And today I'll explain them by discussing two examples. First, I'll talk about a set of maps called Europe in 2035 that were published in 2012. And since we can't look at these maps, I'll just tell you that they're maps of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and kind of the western part of Russia. And what they do is they redraw the boundaries. And they redraw the boundaries in interesting ways. They're labeled in Russian, but since I don't speak Russian, I don't treat them as a text. They didn't sort of touch me as a text, they touch me as a visual. And I argue that this is sort of a futurology exercise, drawing a map of what the world will look like in the year 2035. And it uses visual images not simply to represent the world or represent an ideology, but I think they make something or they do something. They creatively make a new regional order and perhaps a new world order. The maps generally show how much of Eastern and Western European nation states, the familiar kind of post-Cold War boundaries that we know today, it sees them fracturing along subnational lines. So Italy, for example, is divided up into 4 different countries: North Italy, South Italy, and then different islands are free. So in the United Kingdom, Scotland is independent and Ireland is reunited. And while this is going on in sort of Western Europe and also fragmenting Belarus and Poland and the Ukraine, not surprisingly, this map, this Russian map, shows Russian territory growing to include most of the former Soviet Union. So this map was kind of making its way around the internet in 2012, and it was picked up by Foreign Policy magazine, and someone wrote an article about it, and they concluded that these maps actually show Putin's geopolitical fantasies. This is how Putin wants the world to look in 2035, with an expanded Russia and a fragmented Western Europe. And of course, it's easy to dismiss such maps as unscientific fantasies that are merely propaganda. And one way to deal with the map is to deconstruct it, to use my first analytical strategy to see how these maps are a social construction of the visual. And when we start deconstructing these maps, we see that foreign policy actually was duped into broadcasting fake news of kind of right-wing propaganda from Russia's top tabloid newspaper, Express Gazeta. So that's one thing, is that you find out that, oh, it's not necessarily what Foreign Policy magazine thought it was. But it turns out that if you dig a little deeper, you find out that the Russian tabloid is not even the original source of these maps. They first actually appeared on a popular Ukrainian website. So it's not the Ukraine, it's Russia. And Russia and Ukraine were had a lot of friction at this time. So in a sense, this makes it more of a puzzle. While the authorship of the Russian tabloid article is anonymous, there's no author on it, the author of the Europe in 2035 story on the Ukrainian website is well known, or not well, he's known. He's a commentator, Igor Lezev. He's a young writer in Ukraine. So rather than presenting kind of a sober analysis of Europe's future that is based on interpreting secret Russian intelligence sources, it turns out that the Europe in 2035 maps were created by not just a Ukrainian commentator, he's a novelist, and he's not just any kind of novelist, he's a horror novelist. So it's this horror, sort of international relations through sort of horror movies and horror novels. So in a way, it appears to foreign policy, what appears to foreign policy to be the official plan for Putin's preferred world order could very well just be a prank done by a guy in his bedsit with nothing else to do on a weekend. So here what I'm doing is using what I call the visibility strategy to understand how images are important, not just because of the content of their meaning. We also need to consider how the meaning of an image is constructed by the who, when, where, and how issues of how the image was produced, how it's distributed, and then who views it and where. This strategy is important because kind of this hermeneutic style strategy enables us to speak truth to power by revealing power relations, the power relations behind the image, about who's benefiting from this and where did this image come from. But actually, the book argues that it's not enough to deconstruct images. A lot of people have been deconstructing images for the past 25 years, and I've been doing it, and lots of excellent analysis has done this sort of deconstruct the image, show the power, the global power of Hollywood type of thing. But in the book, I argue that the impact of images is not limited to empiricist questions of their scientific accuracy or hermeneutic questions of their secret hidden sources. I say that the maps took on weight and influence not based on their truth value or their ideological value, but their sort of affect value as they circulated in cyberspace. They first circulated in Russian language networks through the online tabloid newspaper, and then they kind of went around the world again through Foreign Policy's English language online article. And they kind of cultivated and mobilized different audiences. So in Russia, it was mobilizing segments of public opinion that longed for a Novy Russia, new Russia, kind of resurgent Russia. While at the same time in the West, it was mobilizing segments of public opinion that are concerned about an expansionist Russia, about an emergent Russia. In both cases, I argue that it underlines how visual artifacts can mobilize people not just rationally through kind of information and explanation, but emotionally. It mobilizes them emotionally in what I call affective communities of sense, that these communities are formed through affect and through sensual kind of connection. So getting back to the maps, people responded viscerally to what they saw rather than rationally to what they understood. Critical inquiry here changes from asking how is the image constructed to ask how does it make you feel? Because images can viscerally move us in unexpected ways, I argue that they need to be appreciated not just in terms of their ideological value, but also in terms of their affect work. Not just what they mean, but also how they make you feel, how they make people feel. And it's not just sort of an internal individual feeling. The notion of affective community shows that it's not just individual, it's a collective feeling. So it's how they make us feel both as individuals and as collectives. The Europe in 2035 episode also shows how almost anyone, including a young Ukrainian horror novelist, can make a map that does things. So visual politics is no longer just about elites kind of pushing propaganda on us in a top-down way. It's sort of bottom up and also lateral. It comes from all directions, I argue. And that these maps can do important things here, even sort of provoking new social configurations between Russians, Europeans, and Americans that go far beyond the intent of any particular author. So to me, this odd episode shows how visual images can work not just in narrative ways, but in non-narrative ways and in non-linear ways to construct social relations by provoking emotions, both positive emotions of pride, Russian pride, but also negative emotions of fear that themselves are political performances, that it's all about performing affective communities of sense. In this way, the Europe in 2035 maps work performatively to create new visions of social order and world order by provoking new affective communities of sense. So this is what I do in each of my chapters. I kind of pick a case study, an image, a film, a visual artifact. And I first deconstruct it to see if there's hidden meaning there and reveal the hidden ideological meaning. But I don't stop there. I then try to show how we need to go beyond textual analysis to see how visual images and multi-sensory artifacts like walls and imperial gardens can be very active in provoking new social orders and new world orders. The second example that I'll discuss today is about the multi-sensory politics of walls. But rather than explain it, I'll try to show a 3-minute film called Great Walls that I hope illustrates my arguments about theory and method. So I saw this on the share screen, so I'll try again. Where is it? There. Yeah. Gonna work. Oh, well, it's not going to work. This is very disappointing. So anyway, what I do, I have a chapter in the book about the visual politics of walls. And what I try to do is to use the Great Wall of China to analyze the current controversy over the US-Mexico barrier, which I call Trump's wall. And what I try to do is not just deconstruct how walls are barriers, how walls divide people, which they do, of course. And I actually point to the Chinese case that the Great Wall of China actually works quite similarly to the racist arguments behind the current wall project on the US-Mexico border, that the Great Wall of China in many ways was to kind of divide civilization from barbarism and to promote China as civilized while naming everything outside the wall as barbaric. But in both the chapter and in the film, what I try to do is show how walls do lots of other things too, how they are not just an infrastructure, a border infrastructure that divides people, they're also what some of us call an infrastructure of feeling that kind of guides emotions in a very practical and materialist way. And that these infrastructures of feelings, especially using the Chinese case, aren't always negative and exclusionary. If you kind of look at how the Great Wall of China works in Chinese discourse, people love the wall. And so in the film, I interview a bunch of people at the Great Wall of China, and where they say, I love the wall. The wall is great, which if you went to the US-Mexico barrier, you'd be, if people said that, you would say, oh, they're right wing, whatever. Whereas what surprised me about interviewing people about the Great Wall of China is that, left-wing radicals, progressive, centrists, everybody loves the Great Wall. And that's what kind of perplexed me. So in the film, what I try to do is not just make sort of verbal explanations about how the Great Wall can help us understand the US-Mexico barrier in new ways. What I did is I got a lot of footage, archive footage and documentary footage to show people kind of doing things at the wall, at the Great Wall of China and also at the US-Mexico barrier, and doing things in playful, ironic, and productive ways that show the wall is not just a barrier that separates people, it's also an infrastructure of feeling that brings people together. Even in protest, it's still bringing them together. So one of the things, I guess one of the points about this chapter and about my book in general is that it's trying to deal with one of the issues that has become much more important lately in IR theory, that IR theory is very Eurocentric, and that we use Western theory to analyze not just the West, but to analyze the Middle East and Asia and other places. So in the book, what I try to do is sort of mobilize concepts and practices and experiences from outside the West to analyze things, not just to analyze, not just Chinese theory for China, but use Chinese theory to talk about the politics of veils and the politics of gardens and the politics of walls.
Sorry, William, you have been talking for 15 minutes now. So
okay.
Could you wrap up?
I am about to wrap up. I have 4 more lines.
Perfect.
So my book aims to decenter our understanding of social theory and international politics, first by expanding from the verbal to include the visual and the multisensory. Second, by expanding from Eurocentric investigations to a more comparative approach that looks to Asia and the Middle East. And third, by shifting from critical IR's focus on inside, outside, and self-other distinctions to see politics in terms of creative processes of social ordering and world ordering. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, William. That was a great presentation. Thank you very much. And I'm really looking forward to reading the book. Okay, so we now have a Q&A session. Are there any questions for William? Please just raise your blue hand. Okay, we have a question from Aleksandra. Hi, Alex.
Hello.
You can go first.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So thank you very much for this presentation. My name is Aleksandra Spalinska. I'm from University of Warsaw, and I would like to comment what you mentioned about visual aspect of maps, especially political maps, and I think that is very interesting also for me because I'm dealing with non-state actors primarily and global governance, and I think that it's very important that many people, ordinary people, mainly think about global politics in terms of political map, as they see it, normal political maps. And the problem is that many political processes like global governance or non-state actors engagement are not seen on maps. And I think that is very interesting just for from the perspective of visual politics. And I'm not sure, what do you think about this aspect, and did you regard this in your research? Because it's not only the thing of propaganda or identity of a certain nation or state, but rather it's related to the thing how we think about politics in general. And from my perspective and my research, this focus on political maps is even too strong for contemporary political analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Aleksandra. Yeah, I guess your point is that what political maps of the world do is they sort of entrench the idea of geopolitics and the nation state as at the center of global politics, whereas global governance is about, transnational norms and things. And what I try to do, or what interests me about maps, is how they, especially strange maps like the Europe in 2035 map, and some other strange maps that I use, is that they call into question the sort of everyday understanding of IR by saying, oh, the world could be very different, kind of geopolitically with different boundaries. Or one of the things I do in another chapter is look at Chinese and Korean maps to kind of recenter the world away from the West. And what does the world look like when you are not taking for granted Westphalian norms? What does it look like when you're looking at Chinese ideas like Tianxia, all under heaven, not just as some idealized kind of way of reorganizing the world, but as something that's discussed? Because one of the things that I found is that Korean cartographers and Vietnamese and Japanese map makers, they were all kind of playing with Chinese map making conventions to promote different views. So it's not like we have one common sense view now, and then there was a different common sense view 300 years ago in China. It's like there was always debate about how the world should look. And that one of the ways we engage in the debate about how the world should look and how it should work is by drawing alternative maps.
Shall I jump in?
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you very much. Sorry, I was muted first. Yes, Michelle, you can go next.
Thanks, Bill, for this talk, which I very, very much enjoyed. And of course, I'm a fan of the book as well. Nice to see everyone here. I was wondering, Bill, a lot of scholarship in sensory politics tends to conceptualize sight as the least affective of the senses, and often privileges hearing and smell and taste as offering more direct routes to affective influence. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how sight works with regard to affect. Like, what are the mechanisms by which sight is generating affect? I would just be interested in hearing your thoughts on that. Thank you again.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for your question. The question you're asking is about how sight or how visuals kind of generate affect. Is one that really perplexed me about 5 years ago. And I spent about 6 months trying to find people in visual studies who were addressing it. And I have to say, I didn't really find any good answers, or the answers were going into sort of biology, which is not the direction I wanted to go into. So I don't really have an answer for why the visual or how the visual generates effect. One thing that I will say is that because I've been working on this book for about 12 years, not 12 years, about 8 years, since 2012. And when I started off, it was all about shifting from the textual to the visual. And as I wrote more and more, it was thinking, oh my gosh, it's not talking about the visual is really not enough. We need to talk about other senses. And I know you talk about hearing and the kind of the global politics of sound. And that's just fascinating. For me, what I decided to do was not to try and cover all 5 senses or all multiple senses, but to see if I could generate a kind of a research agenda and some research questions about affect that use visual images and visual artifacts that left things open for sort of multisensory things. So it's not just the visual construction of the social, it's also the auditory construction of the social and the social construction of the auditory. So I'm hoping that my book will be helpful to people who are doing the very important work of looking at hearing and smell and taste and the affect work of that. But it's just, there's so many interesting things to study, and I decided to finish this book before I kind of started that project.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. So we have one more question in the chat from Armando. And the question is, what would be, according to your perspective, the importance of visual politics in the conjunction of forces for the conclusion of an international treaty?
How do visuals work for a conclusion of an international treaty? I guess what I would do is first look at how elites, kind of governmental, political elites, as well as sort of social and economic elites, try to mobilize feeling for or against a treaty through using visuals, and whether it's old style propaganda or whether it's sort of a new way of influencing people. And then I guess what I would do is try and flip that around and see how the issues of the treaty that you're dealing with are very visual. So, you know, the climate change, Paris climate change agreement, the way that people talked about that was deeply visual and deeply multisensory, and that even the whole inconvenient truth argument started off as a slideshow. It wasn't enough to write a book. Al Gore had to get some pictures of ice caps melting and polar bears looking sad. And that, I think, shows the importance of how the visual and the multisensory is involved in politics, not kind of at the end through sort of propaganda after you've already decided what your arguments are, but that the senses are involved in framing the issues right from the very beginning.
Nice. Thank you very much, William. Do we have more questions? Okay, I think I have one question for you, Bill, but I think it's a sort of a naive question. So you are amazingly enough a writer and a filmmaker at the same time, right? I checked out your Vimeo page, which is absolutely fantastic. So I loved it. But my question is, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the relationship between these two media, right? Between film on the one hand and writing books or journal articles on the other. I mean, are you able to do, how do you see it? Are you able to do certain things in a film that you're not able to do in a book and vice versa? So to put it bluntly, why are you doing both, filmmaking and writing books?
Thanks, Christof. It's a good question. The reason I'm making films is because it's fun, because I enjoy it. It's kind of a challenge to try and think visually as well as think in terms of sort of textual arguments. And what I found, so in the book, what I ended up doing, not by plan, but sort of by chance, is that two of the chapters have are paired with films that I was making as I was writing the chapter. So I've already talked about the one about the Great Walls. I made another film called Toilet Adventures, which is about the experience of going to the bathroom in China and kind of the global politics of taking a shit, and the sort of gendered and raced and sort of vulnerability entailed in that. And what I found it really useful to kind of write a chapter and make a film at more or less the same time, or in drafts, because I found that they really spoke to each other. And so on the one hand, in a film, I can do more of the non-verbal, the non-linear stuff. I can show sort of feeling, how feeling is generated. I mean, one of the things you learn how to do as a novice filmmaker is to make people cry. You want to make people cry. You want to generate emotions. But one of the problems of making a film is that you don't have the things that we take for granted when you're writing an essay, is that you don't have footnotes. You can't kind of explain things. Things have to be, in a way, quite straightforward and even linear in making a film, because you can't say, oh, well, this isn't exactly what it seems to be. It's not exactly the person I'm talking about, blah, blah, blah. You just have to kind of go with the film. Whereas in an article, you can make a much more careful argument where you're very kind of clear about what you're saying and not saying. It's much harder to do that with a film. So I don't try to do that with a film. I try to kind of use each medium for what it can do best.
Perfect. Thank you so much, William. Okay, let me just congratulate you once again on your recently published book. So congratulations. I'm really looking forward to reading the entire book.
Okay, thank you.
So perfect. We spent exactly 30 minutes on William's book. And now I turn over to Philip, who will turn us something about the new 20 years crisis. So Philip.
Thank you, Christof. And thank you to BISA and to Crypt for putting the roundtable together, and for the generous introduction from Christof. And I have to say, I'm also looking forward very much to reading both Will Bain's book and Bill Callahan's book. And it's been enjoyable listening to Will's model of visual politics. So my book, I've got a copy here, is looking at the liberal international order. And I suppose it's a familiar trope now that the liberal international order is under stress. I think everyone would agree with that, or most people would agree with the idea that the liberal international order that has prevailed for the last 30 years or so since the end of the Cold War has come under stress. However, I think the debate, for all of its interest and for all of its vibrancy, is circumscribed in a few important ways. And some of these ways, for instance, are that debates on liberal international order at the moment, they tend to be restricted to questions of grand strategy, of the failures of US foreign policy, of geopolitical rivalries, the failures of US nation building, questions about who has dominated US foreign policy, liberal hegemony versus realism, these kinds of questions. And very strikingly, or at least it was striking to me, that the debates on liberal internationalism have thus far not particularly drawn on E.H. Carr, which is surprising to me, at least, or what has been surprising to me, was because not only does Carr provide, not only is one of the kind of foundational figures in the modern discipline of international relations, as everybody knows, but also one of the most incisive and insightful critics of liberal internationalism, and in particular examining how a liberal international order can fail by virtue of its own internal contradictions. And quite strikingly, John Mearsheimer, in his most recent analysis of liberal hegemony in international affairs, he explicitly puts E.H. Carr to one side and says he'll proceed with his analysis of liberal internationalism without him. So what I seek to do in the book is to bring E.H. Carr's analysis to bear on liberal international politics, to use his critique of the liberal international order that has prevailed since the end of the Cold War, and in particular what I've styled as the last 20 years, our new 20 years crisis. And what's striking about, what's exceptionally interesting to me, and what's so striking about E.H. Carr and the use of him with respect to liberal international politics today, is just how uncanny the similarities are, how strangely striking and how tremendously resonant they are with our contemporary political problems and the way in which we conceive of our problems. And obviously what's most interesting about Carr is it's not just a critique of liberal international politics, but also that he charges it with being utopian, that he charges liberal internationalism with being utopian. And I think those strains of utopianism are very visible, in fact, both in the practice and in the theory of international politics. So this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to expand the critique from discussing the failure of nation building in Afghanistan and Iraq, US foreign policy towards China and Russia, to expand it to be, to make it a broader discussion about the failure of liberal international order, to incorporate our experiences in Europe, but also to link it more systematically to developments in IR theory, and to think about how liberal international order and the developments of international relations theory have interlocked with each other over the last 20 years or so. And some of these, I mean, uncanny similarities, I think, just to headline them, to put them at the front, as it were, is one of the most striking is the ineradicable commitment to liberal war. And that seems to me particularly remarkable. The commitment to proceeding with a self-evidently failed policy. And then another would be, to give another example, would be, say, the utterances of Mario Draghi, the president of the European Central Bank, who was overseeing the European Union's debt crisis since 2011 until 2019, looking at them, the remarkable statements of dogmatic and rigid commitment to self-evidently failed and failing policies. He could be channeling Woodrow Wilson from the 1920s, when Woodrow Wilson said, if it can't work, it must be made to work. The similar sentiments expressed throughout the politics of the European Union and its debt crisis over the last few years. So I think this rigid and dogmatic commitment to liberal ideals in this, as they come under increasing stress, speaks to me, motivates the turn to Carr, and speaks to me of the profound utility of seeking to provide a neo-Carrian analysis. So what I do in the book, I frame a 20 years crisis, a new 20 years crisis from 1999 to 2019. So this new 20 years crisis of ours ends in 2019 when, as The Economist put it, the world turned up on the streets, when you had mass protests breaking out in various capitals all over the world, just on the eve, of course, of the global pandemic. The reason I think 1999 is a good year with which to identify the start of our 20 years crisis is because many of the problems that I think that the liberal international order is undergoing in the last couple of years can be identified, their roots can be identified and traced back to 1999. Just as paralleling Carr's critique, that the roots of the problems being confronted in the late 1930s could be identified in the peace settlement following the First World War in 1919. And there are two events in particular in 1999 that I think lay the foundations for the pattern of international politics and the rise and fall of the liberal international order. The first is the Kosovo War, the NATO bombing campaign against former Yugoslavia over Kosovo. Important in a number of respects. It's the peak of a certain vision of liberal idealism in the post-Cold War era. And again, like with remarkable uncanniness, it even seems to follow the patterns which was outlined by Lord David Davis, who was E.H. Carr's nemesis in the interwar period. And his vision, his original vision was that of a League Air Force. So an international police force with a powerful and mighty air force that would be able to conduct international police operations on behalf of the League of Nations. That was Lord David Davis's vision from the interwar period, and with this remarkable historic parallel that the humanitarian intervention in 1999 over Kosovo has, seems to be fulfilling the prescriptions of Carr's nemesis, Lord David Davis, almost to the letter. What's important about Kosovo isn't just that it's a certain peak of the liberal idealism, but that it also stimulates and lays the ground for Russian revanchism. So the way in which Russia, as it's become more self-assertive over the last 20 years, has consistently returned to the precedent of Kosovo as a way to justify its own interventions, as a precedent for its own interventions, and also as stimulating Russia's need to defend its self-interest. Kosovo also sets the ground for Iraq in quite obvious ways, another liberal intervention which proceeded without the support of the UN Security Council and leads to great disruption at the level of relations between the great powers and lays the ground for a cycle of endless bloodshed and conflict in the Middle East. So that's with respect to Kosovo. The second the other reason 1999 is the important date for the start of our 20 years crisis is the Eurozone. The establishment of the unification of national currencies in Western Europe without the construction of a parallel fiscal union or political union, a currency union without a fiscal union. And this remarkable construct is, again, resembles, if nothing else, or the closest resemblance, I think, would be the gold standard, and that the Eurozone is effectively a proxy gold standard. The rigidity of exchange rates forcing internal devaluations is the only way in which national economies can adjust. And again, it parallels remarkably Carr's criticisms of the gold standard in the interwar period. Seem to find, again, to meet their target in the way in which the Eurozone has been so tremendously shackled economies in the European Union and provoke such tremendous and terrible costs, particularly in the debt-prone southern countries of the Eurozone. So those are the two reasons that I would start the crisis in 1999 and see how these factors, the roots of our crisis, are laid in 1999, and in terms of international security and in terms of international political economy. They work their way through over the next 20 years. And we've come through a cycle of crisis, I think, in 2019 and emerged into something new, which we have difficulty identifying. The other element that I would stress in terms of, or relationship to IR theory specifically, and to take the Carrian insight that power conditions all of our frameworks and outlooks. And this is particularly with respect to constructivism and critical theory. So whereas John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt and others have made powerful criticisms of liberal internationalism, I would extend Carr's critique to incorporate critical theory and constructivism, and to show that they, in the book, I tried to show how they too express an underlying distribution of power, and effectively a unipolar distribution of power. So theories whose emphasis is typically on voluntarism and on agency, theories that have their whole ethos has been to insist on the malleability and plasticity of political and social life. For me, that expresses a unipolar world, a world in which you have an overwhelming concentration of power without any limit or check on that power, and no alternative countervailing sources of power, in which power can be fundamentally contested. You have a limitless vision of power, essentially. And I think there is a deep complementarity between critical and constructivist theories of international politics and a unipolar distribution of world power. So the same way that Carr criticizes liberal internationalism of the interwar period, how it lends itself to wishful thinking through the neglect of power, I lay the same charge at our post-positivist, critical, constructivist theories of our day. So the remarkable, again, parallel that I think leads to, in which Carr traces the way in which liberal and utopianism of the interwar period, through it confronting its failures, it collapses into impotent moralizing and a flight from reality. I think that's also deeply visible, very visible in our politics at the moment. That the failure to, when institutions and policies fail, there's a retreat from reality. And this collapse into condemning reality that fails to fit our preconceived standards. And I want to insist, I think, that even if less ostentatiously bloody than the failures of US democratization and the failures of nation building that we've seen in the Middle East, I want to insist that I think the Eurozone in particular and the European Union constitute bizarre and monumental demonstrations of utopian folly that very much fit the kinds of criticisms that Carr has applied to liberal internationalism in the interwar period. And in particular, the construction, the way in which the European Union has behaved over the last 20 years, I think reflects, it's a remarkable vindication of Carr's politics and his critique of liberal internationalism. Because one of the core aspects of his critique from the interwar period is how liberal internationalism cannot sustain, it cannot withstand the incursions of mass politics. And that the more that mass politics grows, or the more that mass politics diverges from liberal internationalist precepts, the more difficulty liberal international frameworks have with incorporating the reality of international politics at the time. And remarkably, the way in which the European Union has functioned has been effectively to evacuate mass politics from national and international politics. It's been constructed on the basis of repelling mass democratic politics, and in so doing, it's constructed a harmony of interests effectively. So a utopian harmony of interests has been built through, at the level of intergovernmental elites and through intergovernmental agreement, and institutionalized in the form of the European Union. So a remarkable vindication of Carr's analysis of liberal international politics, that it survives by virtue of repelling the mass from the mass politics from the way in which political outcomes are deliberated, agreed, and realized. And then to close the presentation, I think the limits of the Carrian framework are in many ways just as instructive and interesting as the many uncanny parallels of Carr's analysis. So, as I'm sure most people know, that famously the latter third of Carr's book is preoccupied with his own kind of prescriptions for international politics. So whereas the first part of the book, the first half, 2/3 of the book, is focused on this scathing realist critique of what he calls utopian politics, in the last third he relents and pulls back and begins to offer his own prescriptions. So paralleling Carr's pivot in my book, I also try to step back from the framework of the Carrian analysis and the 20 years crisis. And I would want to suggest that the very ease of the replicability of Carr's analysis.
Philip, you talked for 15 minutes now, just to let you know.
I'll wrap up in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
So the very ease with which Carr's analysis of the decline of liberal international order can be reproduced suggests to me that it's not simply the fact that this is built into our frameworks, but is also built into our institutions. So this feeling or the fear that we're always living on the brink of calamity, that we're living in a perpetual interregnum, and that we're constantly living on the brink of the collapse of international order, the collapse of international law, and the descent into calamitous conflict and the fragmentation of the international. I think this speaks to the fact that the 20 years crisis is built into not only our expectations, but also the way in which our political institutions at the international level are structured. And so to transcend not only utopianism, but also Carrian critique, I think that requires us to break with the inherited institutions of the 20th century and not to be afraid to break with the inherited politics of the past.
Thank you very much, Philip. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for a great presentation. Okay, do we have any questions? Okay, I see 2 hands up. Kazushige, sorry, I didn't know if I pronounced that correctly. First, and then Emmanuel.
Hello?
Yes.
This is Kazushige. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting for me to hear. And my question is to what extent do you think what you have just described about the European Union can be applicable to the ongoing crisis? Because you mentioned about the Euro and the things. I'm from Japan, and we were always very fascinated how the European Union continued to ignore science. As you said, I'm from the economic faculty. We always run that, fiscal union, monetary union, they need to be together if you want to have it. This is a basic science. It's not like complicated science. This is like undergraduate economics 101 class kind of science, but Japanese economists have always warned the European Union that you cannot work in this way, but they have always said that European Union is value-based society, value-based community, and they use value to justify the ignorance of science. So my question is that, do you think this kind of attitude that ignores science by the European Union is continuing current response to Corona? Because we see that they do not restrict street protests, they do not restrict movements, even though the science explicitly shows that restrictive measures need to be taken like we do in Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Philip, do you want to answer one question after the other, or should I just collect 3 questions?
Whatever you prefer.
Whatever you prefer. I don't care.
Okay, I'll take the questions one by one.
Perfect.
So thank you for your question. Kazushige, hopefully I've pronounced that, I haven't pronounced that too badly. So I mean, I would say that that's entirely, the core of the critique, and that the only way to explain, or one way at least, which I find a compelling way to explain the divergence from what you think would be a very basic acceptance, the divergence from the idea that you need a fiscal union, you need a political union to complement a monetary union, is explained by utopianism, by a Carrian analysis of liberal utopianism would explain it. And the fact that it is, like you say, defended in terms of a harmony of interests, the idea that there is an underlying convergence between all the member states of Europe, and that this trends over time towards a greater moral community. I mean, it seems to me there is no way to account for that without reference to a critique of utopian ideals, of the folly of projecting a particular vision of international order into the future and then seeking to engineer reality around it. And just as Carr claimed about utopianism in the interwar period, that its rigidity actually exacerbates conflict. The inflexibility of its institutions and its outlooks leads to sharper international conflict because states feel incapable of resolving their differences within the frameworks provided. And that is exactly what's occurring with the Eurozone as well, that it has led, in fact, to renewed tension and conflict between the states of Europe, between the southern tier of the Eurozone and the northern tier, between the Italians and the Spanish and the Greeks on the one hand, and the Germans and the Dutch and the French on the other. And so harmony, a moral harmony substitutes the wishful thinking substitutes for factual analysis, as Carr predicted. The desire for a moral community substitutes for the hard analysis of like you say, I mean, basic scientific understanding of the construct of international institutions and currencies. I'm not sure the parallel stretches so far as to incorporate the response to Corona, because there's been much more variation in terms of national responses to Corona, and much less the rigidity of the Eurozone in terms of the way in which it constricts national responses to economic crises is very different from the range of responses that we've seen. So the Spanish and the French and the Italian responses have been very different to the German and Swedish and British responses, for instance, and the outcomes don't seem to match any particular pattern. The German kind of response was less kind of severe, say, than the Italian response to Corona. So I don't see that there is I don't see the parallel really stretches. But within the politics and institutions of the European Union, I think that the enforcement of utopian harmony and the reliance on dramatic kind of aspiration substituting for a more hard-headed and pragmatic politics is consistently visible through the 20 years crisis of our own era, and is consistently visible right down to looking at the headlines on any day of the week.
Thank you so much, Philip. Next in line, we have Emmanuel, and then we have Aleksandra again. So Emmanuel, please.
Hi. Measurement at the University of Nottingham.
Can't hear you, I'm afraid, Emmanuel.
Sorry, Emmanuel, I can't hear you. I can't understand you.
Sorry.
Not really. Can you maybe type up the question?
Sorry.
No worries. Okay, he can type up the question if he wants to, and we go with Aleksandra next.
Hello, Aleksandra here once again. I'm from University of Warsaw. Do you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So thank you very much for your presentation. Yes, and yes, I get your point, and I fully understand your concerns about international politics at the beginning of the 21st century. But I have two questions, maybe a bit provocative for you. So the first is that many scholars assume that the beginning of the 21st century is really the time of crisis, but the time of crisis which is something like, as you mentioned, interregnum. So for example, Pierre Hasner or Parag Khanna, and according to them, just a new reality is creating. So to see the results, we cannot stop them immediately, but rather wait a bit to see what happened. And that probably the reality, the Westphalian reality of Cold War and interwar period is somewhat fading away. And so this is the first thing here. And I know that it's a bit different perspective than yours, but I would like to ask you, what do you think about that? And the second is the European Union. So I think it's a similar case, because also it is indicated that we have something like a state building process in the Western Europe. So many scholars assume that we will have in the nearest future something like European Federation, and many of them wait for that even very much. And even despite some critique of that, still it is it's being assumed that we will have in the future something like European state. And for example, it is also indicated that in the last negotiations for the new budget, we had the first step for example, for mutualization of the debt. So there are some signs that this fiscal union will be achieved somewhat in the future. And also I would like to mention here China and China issues, because also some scholars assume that we have a nation building process in China right now. And for example, how the minorities are treated also is the sign of that. So it's not only the Europe which is trying to unite and to create something like a state, but also we have this in the other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Aleksandra. So with respect to the first part of your question and the nature of the, if I've understood, I suppose my response is that I think it's precisely this, the very ease with which we see the disintegration of international order and the emergence into a more conflictual and fragmented order, and our fears associated with that. I think that is an inheritance of the 20th century. And it's not something which is, it's not just something which is ideological or intellectual or moral, though it is those things. I think it also is built into our institutions. So the way in which the United Nations, NATO, various kind of institutions are still structured around the inheritance of the 20 years crisis. I mean, how many, the way in which we're always seeking to avoid the fate of the League of Nations, the way in which we're always seeking to avoid appeasing dictators, the way in which we're always seeking to avoid nationalist great power conflict, the way in which we're always seeking, thinking about where a new tyrant might emerge on a campaign of world conquest, these fears that are inherited from the 20 years crisis. And I think the fact that they've not materialized, I think, should tell us to try and push beyond the fears of the 20th century. So as what I tried to suggest in my, both in the book and in the presentation, is that to really get beyond the 20 years crisis, it requires us not only to be willing to kind of criticize the repeated efforts at liberal utopianism, but also to transcend our fears about the notion that we're condemned to repeat these cycles of repetitive decline of liberal international order, and not to be afraid of being willing to be innovative in terms of our political responses, and not to be afraid that we're destined to crumble into a repeat of the 20th century if we make any effort to break from the existing institutions of the status quo. And then with respect to the European Union and state building, I suppose I would say that it's a very odd, I don't think, I mean, federalism in European discussions is an abeyance. So intergovernmental agreement seems to be more of the pattern of European Union politics. And what's striking to me is how shy so many supporters of the European Union are about their future vision. Very few are able to articulate in any kind of definitive sense whether they really believe that federal Europe is in our future, or if a single state, when it will emerge, or what it would look like, or how it might be, because I think they shy away from it. And instead, it's a cloudy haze. The future is obscured by this cloudy haze of, you know, maybe there'll be greater role for this, and maybe there'll be more debt mutualization, and maybe there'll be another treaty, maybe there'll be new forms of cooperation. And that haziness and that unwillingness to specify definitive forms of what the political future of Europe looks like, that tells me it's the telltale shimmering of utopian thinking. A cloudy and obscure future, because I think very few people are willing to publicly commit to the idea of a European federal state. Very few people are willing to do that. And instead they have recourse to vague hand-waving gestures about what the future of Europe might look like. And I remain unconvinced by the kind of halting efforts at debt mutualization because once those debts are divided up among the states that are eligible for them, it won't be very significant. You're not talking about the kind of public spending that those countries need. And they have already indicated their unwillingness to take on new loans from the European Union because of the conditions with which those loans will come. And I think, we're likely also to see greater skepticism in the countries that are committed, that are paying into the new debt initiatives. We might even see, say, a referendum in the Netherlands on whether the Netherlands should continue to support the greater spending commitments which have been enacted by the European Union. So I remain unconvinced that we're seeing a pattern of state consolidation, quite the opposite. I think what we're seeing is the effort to enforce, again, a harmony of interests, a liberal harmony of interests that simply doesn't exist in reality, that there are growing political tensions between the states of Europe, and they won't be magicked away by attempts to enforce community at the European level.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Philip. We spent exactly 30 minutes on your book as well. So that's great time management. Unfortunately, we can't. I can't take Emmanuel's 2 questions. Sorry, we ran out of time. Thank you very much again, Philip, and congratulations again on the publication of your new book. Okay, last but not least, we have William Bain, who will introduce his book, Political Theory of International Order. William.
Thanks, Christof. Just a quick correction. The title is Political Theology of International Order.
Theology, sorry, Freudian slip.
That's fine. I just want to say by way of beginning just how pleased I am to be involved with a crypt event. If I'm not mistaken, my very first paper that I presented at BISA in 1998, I believe was sponsored by crypt. So I'm feeling a bit long in the tooth here. The objective of my book is to uncover presuppositions of international order that originate in medieval theology. Now, of course, this runs counter to the prevailing narrative of international relations, according to which talk of God has been gradually drained away, leaving a secular domain to speak for itself. I challenge this narrative by arguing that theological ideas didn't simply fall away, but rather familiar ways of thinking about international order are correctly interpreted as a worldly application of a theological pattern. Now, before proceeding any further, I want to issue 2 important clarifications. The first relates to the term political theology. Political theology, as I deploy it or understand it in the book, involves the analysis of politics, institutional arrangements, sources of authority, patterns of order, purposes and justifications and rule and so forth in the context of theological concepts and categories. This leads to the second important disclaimer, and that is this book is not itself a work of theology. Rather, the argument is historical and philosophical in orientation. And the point I want to make is that the language of international order, as we tend to use it, has a history that includes theological antecedents. Thus, to be clear on this point, there's nothing about the book or its argument that should be confused with a call to faith. Now, my point of departure in the book is a 13th century theological dispute about the nature of God and the extent of his power. And this dispute yielded rival theories of order, which I argue are still present in contemporary international relations. The first of these theories is the theory of immanent order, which is, or rather reflects a synthesis of Greek philosophy and Christian revelation. The key figure here is Plato, although it's not the Plato of the book that comes first in the Western canon of political thought, namely the Republic, but rather it's the Plato of the dialogue Timaeus, which explains the order of the cosmos as the work of a demiurge who brings together pre-existing matter and pre-existing form to fashion an ordered cosmos. Now, what's significant about this story, this cosmos-making story in Timaeus, is that the visible world is framed in terms of eternal forms that dictate a rationally intelligible and indeed necessary pattern of place and purpose, and that individual things contribute to the perfection of the whole. Now, the problem with this story, as I've presented it thus far, is that it contradicts what is written in Genesis, and therefore no Christian can believe what's written in Timaeus as such. The point here is that the God of Genesis is no mere craftsman who makes by arranging what already exists. On the contrary, God is a creator properly so called, who created the universe out of nothing. Now, the decisive synthesis that brings together the Neoplatonic God of Athens and the biblical God of Jerusalem is given by Augustine. Augustine retains the idea that God created the universe according to a rational plan, that is, the forms that guide the work of the demiurge. However, Augustine rejects the idea that they are eternal or pre-existing. Rather, the forms for Augustine are located within the divine intellect, in the mind. Augustine says in this respect, quote, they, referring to the forms, must be thought to exist nowhere but in the very mind of the creator. Now, what's important to grasp about this theory of order is that a distinctive conception of order corresponds with this particular understanding of God. Order is understood as an interconnected whole in which individual things jointly compose a necessary pattern of right order. Moreover, this pattern is luminous to reason, and it is explained in terms of existence and purpose. Augustine explains this idea when he says in The City of God that the tranquility of order consists in, quote, the disposition of equal and unequal things in such a way as to give each its proper place. Now, this theory of immanent order as an interconnected whole can be contrasted with the theory of imposed order, a theory that reflects an attempt on the part of certain medieval theologians to vindicate God's freedom as against the rational necessity of creation, as you know, in the Greek sense, that might qualify God's freedom. So the concern is that if the universe is rationally intelligible, then this rational necessity might qualify God's freedom. So so-called nominalist theologians, William of Ockham foremost amongst them, prioritize the biblical conception of God, that is, the God of power and might, a God who speaks the universe into existence by sheer force of will and the efficient causality of the words, let it be. But vindicating God's unfettered freedom in this way had the effect of destroying the rational plan that guided the creative act as Augustine understood it. As a result, all things visible and invisible, all logical entities, all propositions of truth, all possibility and impossibility are simply mandates of the divine will and nothing more than mandates of the divine will. Again, a distinctive conception of order corresponds with this particular understanding of God. Order is a radically contingent arrangement that's composed of individual or singular things that have no inherent connections with any other thing. That is to say that every thing in the universe is a thing considered in itself. Order, to the extent that it exists, is imposed from without in a system of external relations, and knowledge of this pattern is acquired by empirical observation and the investigation of efficient causes. Both theories, as I alluded to a moment ago, are present in contemporary international thought. Imposed order is the dominant discourse. international order, as we tend to talk about it, is a contingent arrangement that is made and unmade. However, the theory of immanent order survives as a rhetoric. It's invoked to stabilize the contingency of a constructed world. And in this sense, it serves as the halter and bit of unfettered freedom that limits what can be done in the name of will and artifice. It's important to bear in mind, though, that these theories represent incommensurable positions. They are distinct modes of understanding and explanation that cannot be combined to form a composite account of order. Now, I can't provide a synopsis of the book, but I did want to provide these two rival theories of order because they are the spine, if you will, that runs through the book. But because of time, I can't give you a synopsis of the book as such. So I want to touch on three prominent, dominant themes in the book. And the first is continuity and change, especially continuity and change as it relates to medieval and modern. John Ruggie once famously said that the transition from medieval to modern is, quote, the most important contextual change in international politics this millennium. I argue that this contrast is not nearly as great as many imagine, and in some respects, it is substantially wrong. Take, for example, the Renaissance and the Reformation, which are typically given as the gateways or the doors through which we marched into the modern world. But the Renaissance humanist preoccupation with the affairs of the world didn't involve in any way a turn away from religion. Rather, the return to classical learning typically meant the Christian classics as much, if not more so, than pagan writings. Likewise, Luther's famous separation of sacred and secular didn't secularize the world as we often see in IR writings, but rather it sacralized it in a different way. His point was, in making this distinction, was to describe the twofold nature of Christian life. It's on this basis that I argue that the discourse of continuity is important as the discourse of change. And in doing so, I challenge the story that IR theorists tell about the development of their subject. In short, modern theories of international order are not constructed on a new plot and out of new building materials that are distinctively modern, but rather they are constructed out of the rubble of the Middle Ages. The second theme is rethinking canonical figures, and two are prominent in this regard. The first is Grotius. We all know Grotius as the quintessential theorist of international society, who provided a rather more wholesome alternative to the gladiatorial realm that's described by Hobbes. An approach that subjects the pursuit of self-interest to genuine obligations that repose in rules of law. Yet if you recover the theological content of Grotius' writings, we find that Grotius is no pioneer of modernity, but rather he offered a decidedly Christian vision of the world, a perpetually valid legal order that was grounded in God's reason, which is consistent with the theory of immanent order. And in this sense, what he describes is categorically unlike what English school theorists claim on behalf of Grotius. We find something similar with Hobbes. He, of course, is the quintessential theorist of anarchy, and he describes a world in which the relations of states, we're told, take place in a state of perpetual war that's devoid of law and justice, and as a result, life is, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But if we restore the theological muscle to the logical skeleton of Hobbes's political philosophy, he's rather better understood as a theorist of international society, the basis of which that covenants are genuinely binding in the state of nature. Moreover, human beings on the Hobbesian view, in being reread in this way, is that human beings impose order on a multitude of states in the same way that God created and imposed order on the universe through will and artifice. So again, what's interesting here, again, for the sort of English school theorists, is that what Bull and the likes describe as international society is actually Hobbes properly understood. A third point, dominant theme, is the fragility and emptiness of international order as we tend to understand it. I've said already that the theory of imposed order is the dominant discourse of international relations. But the preoccupation with freedom that is characteristic of the theory of imposed order raises a searching question. Namely, in a world that's nothing but will and artifice, a world that is purely a construction, can anything be truly universal? And it's at this point that the theological inheritance that I have endeavored to uncover begins to unravel. I've said already that modern theories of international order are a worldly application of a medieval theological pattern. However, in contemporary international relations, we don't have ready recourse to appeal to God to guarantee the regularity of order. And as a result, it's necessary to find a substitute to alleviate the anxiety of uncertainty. The most common substitutes for God are rational autonomy and common humanity, to give just two examples there. And yet these ideas, these substitutes, disclose no intrinsic reason in themselves, but rather their authority is supported by assertions of will, just as God mandated the physical and moral laws of nature. The implication of this is that there's no definitive way of resolving disagreement between the postulates that secure our thinking about order, because the cognitive status of rational investigation is no different than belief in God. Leo Strauss made exactly this point in his book on Spinoza when he said, quote, "Philosophy, the quest for evident and necessary knowledge, rests itself on an unevident decision, on an act of the will, just as faith does." What comes out of this is that the way we tend to think about international order, again, may be a great deal more fragile and precarious than we perhaps are willing or comfortable to admit. Arbitrariness is an indelible feature of international order, and therefore what we claim for international
15
order,
minutes, Will.
Oh, okay.
15 minutes.
Just finishing up, is precariously exposed to the whims of power. So where does this lead? Two very quick points. The first is uncovering this theological inheritance serves to demythologize the field, and therefore we understand ourselves better than we do. And the second point is, I think this has an important contribution to decolonizing the field. It helps us understand that Christian culture shapes Western theories of international order to a much greater extent than many people realize. And this has, of course, obviously important implications for a world that is no longer predominantly Western or Christian. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay. Questions for Will? Okay, we have one. I think we have one in the chat. Do you think systemic theories of international order as a system, e.g. Bull or Waltz, more frequently display the immanent or imposed conception of order?
Okay, hold on a second. What I want to do here is let me just answer this very quickly and say, Chapter 7 is devoted to Waltz and his structural realism, and his theory as I argue, is unambiguously an example of the theory of imposed order. Chapter 8 deals with English school theories of international society, liberal theories, and so forth. And they also, I argue, are instantiations of the theory of imposed order. They are examples of a constructed world. And so, so yeah, I mean, that's the quick answer. What I'm looking for here is I had a copy of the table of contents that I wanted to circulate. So, I've just loaded it up if you want to have a look. But so yeah, there are 2 dedicated chapters to your question, both of which I argue are examples of the theory of imposed order.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Will. Do you also want to respond to the second part of the question, which is,
I'm sorry.
There was a Schmittian question. Do you identify any direct analogies between medieval theological ideas and concepts in IR, as Schmitt does, for e.g. with respect to the miracle and the sovereign exception?
So anytime you give a talk on political theology, you get Schmitt question. And one of the things I'd like to point out, I mean, I do discuss Schmitt in the introduction, in part because it's obligatory to do so. But it's also worth saying that this project's not driven by Schmitt, and I actually came to Schmitt very, very late in this regard. I was pleased to hear that Bill said that he spent, it was first 12 and I was happy. Then he said 8 years on his book. It took me 10 years to do this. And I never really looked at Schmitt until really very close to the end. I came to this project through historians of medieval political thought. So Schmitt and the miracle don't figure prominently. I will say, however, I don't find Schmitt terribly interesting on the miracle, because all he's doing is he's rehearsing a well-worn medieval distinction between God's absolute and ordinary power. I do talk about that in places in the book. It's quite actually very important for these nominalist theologians like Occam and the like, this distinction, although I should say that distinction is not specifically nominalist. So I do address that issue of absolute power, the power to reverse the course of nature, but I don't do it through Schmitt.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you very much, Will. I think we have one question from Aleksandra.
Okay. Hello, do you hear me once again?
I do.
Okay, thank you. And I might have, I think, 2 questions. So the first is, as I remember, you mentioned John Ruggie and his contribution to understanding the international and the roots of the international system. And my question is, what is your opinion on so-called new medievalism, as it has been outlined by Hedley Bull in his book An Anarchical Society, and also recently by other scholars? For example, for Jörg Friedrichs, the equivalent of medieval papacy is transnational business or international politics, and of course this is related to so-called historical analogy and to the conviction that postmodern international order can be somewhat similar to the medieval one. And what is your opinion of such analogies as an expert in the theology of international relations? And I think it's okay. And the second one, it's the question related to the typology of orders. So because the most frequent that we have typology divided to immanent, transcendent, and dialectical order. And what is, according to you, how would you call the contemporary international order? Is it or political order at all? Is it still transcendent, as for Carl Schmitt, for example, or immanent, like for example, Hart and Negri? What do you think about such typologies?
Okay, hold on, just jotting a note down here.
Okay.
Okay. With regard to your first question, you asked me my opinion about neo-medievalism. I don't have an opinion as such as to whether or not I think it's good scholarship or bad scholarship, but rather I would make a couple of observations. As I understand that word, the new medievalism, what it is it's actually, I think properly called new feudalism. It emphasizes the point of disparate patterns of authority, overlapping authority, and so forth. That's fine as far as it goes. I'd make the further observation that the place and character of feudalism in international relations scholarship is I think overstated and it's exaggerated. Feudalism it's a tricky subject in the first instance. Feudalism doesn't exhaust political relations, and yet, for whatever reason, feudalism is used in part to frame the emergence of international relations as a subject. In fact, it is one of the key moves of articulating what sovereignty is. It is what contrasts with overlapping feudal relations. Now, the problem with this, and this is something that I do demonstrate on the book, but before saying that, I just want to say on this feudalism thing, if you're interested in, Kathleen Davis has written a really superb book on how the discourse of feudalism is quite distorted in terms of how we tend to think about it. So anyway, what the point I would make and what I do in the book is I suggest that actually feudalism is actually not that important, historically speaking, and making sense of transition from medieval to modern, but rather it's actually ecclesiology. That is, church government is actually a far more interesting place. So IR theorists typically say, well, the Middle Ages are categorically unlike the modern, right? So you have this sharp contrast. And my response to that is it's only a sharp contrast because they've been looking in the wrong places. It's important to bear in mind that the church was understood as a political community in its own right, and the Pope was understood as a monarch. And indeed, they had debates within the church about whether or not the Pope was an absolute monarch or a constitutional monarch. So once you excavate some of these ideas that are in ecclesiology, all of a sudden the medieval politics is no longer so strange and alien. And it also just simply cannot be reduced to feudalism. One last point about feudalism is that actually nobody in the Middle Ages understood feudalism as feudalism. That's actually a modern term that's been read back into history. Again, Kathleen Davis is really very good on this. Your second point is I wasn't entirely sure I understood your question. But what I would say, first of all, in my use of imminent and imposed order, first of all, these are two ways of organizing and thinking about order and reality that were initially articulated by Alfred North Whitehead, and who this was picked up by in a medieval political thought context by a very famous historian of medieval political thought named Francis Oakley. And so that's actually where I got that from. Now, I'm wondering if I'm sending a conflicting or confusing signal, and I perhaps should have explained this at the outset, that when I'm referring to imminent order, I am not referring to what Charles Taylor and others refer to as a secular domain that can be explained on its own terms, but rather the imminent aspect of it is bound up in Greek metaphysics. So these usages of imminent are quite different. And
thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I should have made that clear from the start.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will and Aleksandra. Do we have more questions for Will? Any hands up? Okay, I think I got one for Will. Probably a good one to close the session. So one of the many beautiful things about the book is that it ends on a hopeful note, right? You end with a sort of hopeful outlook, if I understand you correctly. And you first argue in the last chapter very convincingly that these two forms of order that you carefully work out throughout the book, the theory of imposed order and the theory of immanent order, are not perfectly reconcilable, right? And then, nonetheless, you say at the very end of the book that, and I quote, "The horizon is opened once freedom is harnessed to the realization that the present world is not the best possible. That the present world is not the best possible world. Human beings can make a different world in view of some vision of the future." And I just wondered if you could give us a very rough idea, probably, of how such a vision of the future would look, and probably what are some of the concrete political practices, right? Or we might call them the expressions of human freedom, probably, that could initiate such a change.
Yeah. Christof, I'm going to disappoint you because I don't really have a vision in that regard. And it's actually a good opportunity to say that I'm glad you read the conclusion that way, because the conclusion was incredibly difficult to write. And the first draft was decidedly pessimistic, and some of my internal readers said, no, this is not good, and the like. And so I reworked it. The point I'm making in that passage is that there's two ways of reading imposed order and where it leads. And so, I'm not the only one that's interested in nominalist theology and its implications and the like, but you've got some people who are interested in these same things, and what I call imposed order. They argue that it leads to nihilism, right? It's an empty world, nihilism, and therefore you've got to get back to something else, right? Something that escapes the frame of imposed order. For a long time, I think I subscribed to that view. And as I continued to work on the book, I softened that position somewhat. And I guess I would describe my view now to say, well, the theory of imposed order can lead to nihilism, just total cynicism and an empty world, but it not necessarily lead to that, because the master idea, the central idea of the theory of imposed order is freedom, and the idea that human beings can make and unmake their world in the same way that God can make and unmake the universe. And so I guess I came to the point that if those are the undergirding assumptions of this theory, well, there's nothing that necessarily leads to nihilism. That we could make a better world than the world we live in at the moment. But I haven't been to the future yet, so I don't know what that world looks like.
No, absolutely. I just found it very fascinating because, as you just said, parts of the book are rather pessimistic, if that's the right word. But then at the end, I found it very, very interesting, at least, or even fascinating that you end on this hopeful note. So I think the way you play with pessimism and optimism at the same time is very interesting, at least for me.
Well, I think I'm trying to diagnose what I think is a deep-seated tension and how we think about order. And I think that some of that's going to make for some pretty uncomfortable reading for a lot of people. But I'm not prepared to say, well, then it all collapses and nihilism is the only destination. As I said, I've softened on that as I brought the book to a conclusion.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much, Will. Again, many congratulations on a great book.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to reading the entire book. Again, congratulations to all of you, to 3 great books. Thank you very much for presenting. Thank you very much for 3 great presentations. And also thank you very much to the audience for really interesting and really thought-provoking questions, I think. So there will be one more crypt event if you're interested next Wednesday, unsurprisingly perhaps, on reimagining world order. So if you're interested in that, we are again next Wednesday from 2 to 3:30 UK time. So thank you very much to all of you, and I hope to see you next week.